So, welcome back. Here in Module 2, we are going to go ahead and start diving into the discussion of the first of the three key figures we're going to be looking at here in the course. We're going to be looking at St. Athanasius for the next few modules, and we're going to start off by looking at his Life of Anthony, which is going to be the first primary text that we're really going to dive into here in the class. But before I send you off to read that yourselves, I want to take a little time just to introduce the period, introduce Athanasius a little more, to give you a bit of a heads up in terms of what's going on in the work and the kind of questions that we will be discussing when we go to talk about it on Blackboard. So I just wanted to run through that here with you to kind of set the stage for your reading and discussion. And now, again, this is going to be a lot of material for many of you. This is going to be a lot of new ideas, new facts to assimilate. So don't get overwhelmed. I will post on Blackboard an introductory chapter to this period, the patristic period. That's the period of the fathers in the church. So I will post that on Blackboard as an optional reading, and I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with the patristic period, to go ahead and take a look at that, and that can give you a little more sense of what's going on. But hopefully, just from this video, you'll have enough of an idea of who Athanasius is and what's going on in this work that you're going to be able to read it productively. And again, for those of you who are going through the program, we're going to come back to the patristic period quite a bit in the controversies in church history course. So you don't have to get this all perfectly this time around. So we're going to come back to these ideas later on in the class, or later on in the program, so don't get worried if it's a bit much at first. But basically, as I said, Athanasius and Augustine fall within what we typically call the patristic period, right? So this is a period of several hundred years, and there's debates about exactly when it ought to be thought to begin and end. Of course, there's debates about everything in academia. I would say, it's roughly around the year 200 to roughly around the year 600 or so. So we start getting some major theological writers in the late 100s with people like Tertullian and Origen, and then we end up with figures like Gregory the Great in the 500s. And so basically in that range is what we're talking about. So these are the church fathers, and this is a very important period in church history, and it's a period where there are a lot of changes and upheaval, right? We go from a persecuted church where the Roman Empire is persecuting the church, creating martyrs. People are kind of on the run. Then, of course, with Constantine, we get a major change, and the church is no longer persecuted, but is legal, and then quickly becomes actually the preferred religion within the empire. So you have a whole lot of changes in terms of the makeup of the church, and a whole new set of problems to deal with. And, of course, once they stop running from the lion, so to speak, there's time to deal with other issues, like working through the biblical traditions, working through the oral traditions in the church, and trying to start to put together a systematic account of what Christians believe. In the late Roman Empire, which is going on in this time, is not that different in some ways from our own, right? It was a very multicultural, very cosmopolitan world. There are people of all languages and cultures and religions and philosophies mixing together. So you have lots of ideas that you have to try to deal with. And so the patristic period is a very complicated time to study. It's a very complex time, but it's very important in that this is when a lot of the basic tenets of the Christian faith were established, right? And of course, this is the period from which we get, amongst other things, the Nicene Creed that really defines our faith for most Christians in the world today. So that's the period that we're going to be looking at. You need to know a few other kind of basic things about it, right? So one of the most basic things to understand about the patristic period is that it can kind of be divided in half. There's Eastern Church Fathers and there's Western Church Fathers, right? And there's some important distinctions there. Now, right, as we get later in history, there's an actual break between the two churches. So in 1054, the East and West, Rome and Constantinople, split officially and excommunicate each other. We've been living with the consequences of that for about 1,000 years now. And of course, probably many of you know that in recent times there have been some real efforts to try to bridge that gap. We're not talking about that kind of a break. That doesn't happen until much further down the road. But even in the time of Athanasius and Augustine, there are some key differences emerging and some tensions developing between these two halves of the church. Right? So it's really, again, there's two halves. There's the eastern half and the western half of early Christianity. Right? So in the East, there are a number of key centers of the faith and key centers of theological activity. So these would be what are called the patriarchates. So these are key cities where you have patriarchs, that is, important bishops with clear apostolic succession. So there are places like Antioch and Jerusalem and Alexandria, where we have these patriarchs and a lot of theological activity going on. In this eastern half of the empire, we have people speaking and writing in Greek. Right? So this is the language of the New Testament, and this is the language that people in these parts of the empires are speaking and writing in. And it's a language that has a lot of sophisticated tradition to draw on, right? Of course, we have things like the great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and a lot of figures along those lines who are all writing in Greek, right? So I think it's safe to say, as a Western Christian, that the East is much more sophisticated and much more advanced in a lot of ways in this early church period. In the West, so the center of Western Christian thought in the patristic period is Rome, and in Rome and in Italy and also in North Africa, further to the west of Alexandria, you have Christians who are writing and speaking in Latin. And so there's obviously people who can speak and translate both, but as the centuries go on, and as you might know from a basic understanding of world history, the Roman Empire is really starting to crumble as we work into the patristic period. So when Augustine dies, for example, in the early 400s, the barbarian hordes, my Germanic ancestors among them, are literally at the city gates, right? And so the western part of the empire is under pressure from the barbarians, the Goths and the Visigoths and all these guys. And then shortly after that, a few centuries after that, you have the rise of Islam in the east, which really puts a lot of pressure there on the eastern half of the empire. And so both of these halves of the Christian world are facing all kinds of pressures, and so you get more and more isolation of the two halves of the church, right? And so the exchange between them becomes less and less and more problematic, and then of course all of that ultimately builds towards the real split in 1054. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there a bit. But what I want to make sure you have from all of this is that there is a different character that we can see in the works of, say, the Greek Eastern Fathers as opposed to the Latin Western Fathers, right? So in the Greek East, it tends to be more nuanced, more philosophical, more mystical in many ways. So if you've ever attended an Eastern liturgy, it tends to have more of what we would think of as a mystical sort of atmosphere to it. There's a lot of sung prayers, there's a lot of incense, there's a lot of prostrating yourself. And so it's a very different culture in many ways. And that stretches all the way back to the patristic period. So there are differences in language, but there's also all kinds of other differences. The kinds of things that we often find ourselves arguing about in churches even to today. So the clergy in the West, they are clean-shaven. In the East, they have beards. In the East, they use leavened bread for the Eucharist. In the West, of course, we use unleavened. And so there's all these kinds of cultural differences. And that happens too in the theology. So Eastern theology tends to be, particularly early in the patristic period, much more sophisticated and nuanced, careful in its language. It also has more of a sense of mystery that's kind of taken for granted in the theological writing. Now, within the East, there's still a further distinction. So there are different schools of thought in Greek patristic thought. The two major schools are the Antiochian, or a school of thought centered on the city of Antioch, and the Alexandrian, which is, of course, centered on the city of Alexandria. And so Athanasius, the first figure we're looking at, he falls within that eastern half of the early church and into the Greek speaking and writing half of the early church. And he, as the Bishop of Alexandria, clearly is within that Alexandrian school of thought, right? And so, again, we'll talk about this more in a subsequent course, but Alexandrian thought tends to be very philosophical, and it tends to have a lot of Platonic philosophy influencing it. So if you know anything about philosophy, Plato is famous for his idea that there's kind of a divide between the physical realm and this ideal, spiritual, intellectual realm of the forms, right? And so that the real reality, if you will, is this intellectual, immaterial world of the forms, and this physical world that we experience kind of is influenced and shaped by those world of the forms. But our goal is ultimately to kind of leave behind this physical realm and get to this ideal, immaterial realm of the forms. And so that type of thinking tends to influence Alexandrian theology a fair bit. It also tends to focus on sort of the immaterial nature of things, defining really what they are. So human nature is this ideal, right? And all of us as individual humans participate in that ideal and are shaped by it in various ways. But what really makes us human is that we all share this common immaterial essence or nature of humanity. And so that has implications for how we think about how theology works, particularly for things like the incarnation, as we'll see here in a little bit in our class. So Athanasius is working within this Alexandrian Eastern patristic school of thought. It's also, I think, helpful to know that as a bishop of Alexandria, Alexandria in this period is really, I think you could argue, the center of intellect and culture in the ancient world. So Alexandria was a very cosmopolitan city, right? You had a very large Jewish population there, you have a large Christian population there, you have a large pagan population there, but it was famous for its learning and culture, right? Of course, the library at Alexandria is one of the real wonders of the ancient world, so all kinds of texts from all around the world are brought there to Alexandria. And so there's a whole bunch of scholars there connected with the library, reading all these texts, discussing these ideas. And so it was a very rich intellectual atmosphere that Athanasius is brought up in and that he's working in. Prior to Athanasius, there's other important figures in the patristic period who are in Alexandria. So Clement of Alexandria would be one example, and Origen is another early church figure who is brought up in Alexandria and very much influenced by that intellectual atmosphere. So if your idea of the church fathers was just, quiet bearded bishops sitting in their rooms reading and writing, the reality is much more complicated and much more interesting, and I think much more similar to our own experience than many of us might think. Alexandria is a bustling, cosmopolitan, intellectual city, and Athanasius is not just writing theological works, he is living and trying to be a pastor to his people in the midst of this very tumultuous, very energetic city. And so it's important to keep that in mind as we're reading his works, which seem to us, because they are the work of a church father, sort of these ancient texts, and we tend to think of them in very ideal terms. And the reality is much more complicated than that. So, a little more specific information about Athanasius. He's born in 296, so right at the very end of the 3rd century, and then ultimately dies in 373. So he had a good long life, particularly for his period. As I said, he's in Alexandria. He was a priest in Alexandria, and so he is ordained. He's a priest when the Arian controversy breaks out. So for many of you, you might be familiar with Arianism, and we're going to talk more about that as we go through the class, but it's a key early church heresy where another priest in Alexandria, Arius, argues that we ought not to think of the Son as being equal in divinity to the Father. Right, and so he argues that Jesus, the Son, is the highest creature possible, but that he is not like God, and in fact, God creates the Son at some point in very early history. Right, and so this launches really the biggest controversy in the early church, because Arius teaches this, he argues for it, he gets a lot of people to agree with him, and opposing him is the Bishop of Alexandria at the time, Alexander, which is Alexander of Alexandria, always amuses me, even after all these years. But Alexander argues against Arius, and then ultimately this leads to the famous Council of Nicaea, from which we get our Nicene Creed. And so Athanasius actually accompanies Alexander to the council. And so they traveled from Egypt and Alexandria up to modern-day Turkey, to the city of Nicaea, and there they participate in the council that rejects Arius, rejects his ideas, and affirms what Alexander and Athanasius had been teaching, that the Son is equal to the Father in terms of his divinity. And so Athanasius is really shaped by that controversy in an important way. And Alexander died shortly after the Council of Nicaea, and Athanasius becomes the bishop in, let me double check this, 328. Right, so he becomes a bishop in 328, just several years after Nicaea. Then, of course, as some of you might know, a church council doesn't fix everything immediately, right? And I know this will be shocking to you, those of you who are active in the Catholic Church, that, once you have a council, it turns out there can actually be more controversy afterwards than there was before, right? And of course, we've all seen this with Vatican II and the struggles that have gone on in the aftermath of that council that was really supposed to sort things out for us. And a similar thing happens with Nicaea, right? That Nicaea rejects Arius and affirms what Athanasius is teaching, but there's a huge struggle after the council. The Arians don't just simply sign on the dotted line and go along with Nicaea, and so that struggle actually gets worse in the 50 or so years after the Council of Nicaea. As a result of that, Athanasius was actually exiled from his see, from Alexandria, 5 times over the course of his career. So he had a very tumultuous life. And so again, all of this can shape our reading of these works we're going to look at, right? So we're going to look at the life of Anthony, where Athanasius is reflecting on this hermit figure, this man who goes out into the wilderness to seek spiritual growth and a focus on God, which is in many ways, or at least seems to be, really in contrast to Athanasius's life, where he's the bishop of this huge, complex metropolitan city. He's also caught up in this empire-wide debate about the nature of Christ, and he's in constant struggle with the emperor and Arian bishops, to the extent that he's exiled 5 times from his own diocese. So he lived a very tumultuous life, to say the least. But he played a crucial role in the church in defending Nicaea, and ultimately, of course, he prevails. And Athanasius's understanding of the Son's nature, reflected in the Council of Nicaea, is really what basically all Christians believe up to this day, whether we're Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox. So he really plays an important role in the church. So, moving on to the life of Anthony, I wanted to talk about some of the key ideas that are going to be coming up in this work as well, to prepare you to read it in as informed a way as you can after, a fairly short video introduction. But I think it's helpful to know a little bit about what's going on and sort of the background and the context for the text as you dive into it. Right. So Athanasius writes this life of Anthony fairly late in his career, and he is writing about, of course, Anthony the Great, or Anthony of the Desert, who is a very important figure in Christian history in his own right, and he's typically seen as kind of the founder of monasticism in Christian tradition. Now, we probably all have a basic sense of what monasticism is, and it can take the form of a hermit, a person who goes out kind of on their own to practice spiritual discipline, or it can have a more communal form as well. And that distinction is also there in the early church, where you have people either living in community or living on their own in terms of the way they practice their spiritual discipline. But even prior to, of course, Anthony, there were figures who did this. So there were figures who would seek isolation or small communities as a way to really focus on their spiritual lives and to try to get away from some of that tumult of the world that we were talking about a few minutes ago. But Anthony is really the one who kind of shapes the Christian tradition of practicing this type of life. And in particular, he's the first one to kind of go out into the wilderness to practice this type of life. Other figures had lived on the edges of communities, or they would take up residence on the top of a pillar outside of town. A variety of different forms of this happened. But Anthony is important, amongst other reasons, for kind of going out into the desert or going out on a mountain to get a sort of physical separation from the world. Although, of course, as we're going to see, the world often comes to these figures, and Anthony certainly experiences that as well. But again, so for monasticism, Anthony really kind of is in many ways the beginning of it. But of course, asceticism, this practice of a discipline, a physical discipline in pursuit of spiritual benefits, stretches back far earlier, of course, in church history and in biblical history, right? So we can even look in the Old and New Testament and find examples of figures who are called out or go out into the wilderness as a way of developing their spiritual life and developing a particular closeness with God, right? So John the Baptist would be one obvious example of this from the New Testament. In the Old Testament, we have constantly figures who are out in the wilderness, and that's where one encounters God, all the way back to Abraham, who's called away from the civilized world of his time out into this wilderness of the desert and then ultimately Palestine. And so Anthony is drawing on a much larger tradition of the idea that we need to discipline the body in order to make spiritual progress. But he kind of refines and develops that in a really influential way. So Anthony goes out into the desert around the year 270, and he dies in 356. So he's about a generation or so earlier than Athanasius, and so he's an important model for Athanasius in many ways, but they also are contemporaries. So Athanasius knows Anthony, he talks with him, he works with him, and then ultimately when Anthony dies, he was already a very famous figure, and so Athanasius writes this work to tell others about Anthony and his life, amongst other reasons as a potential model, he thinks, for how one ought to practice asceticism and how one ought to live a monastic life. And so there are all kinds of things going on in this work, right? So Athanasius is proposing this, he says this in the introduction, as you'll see, as a model for how this life ought to happen, right? And in Athanasius's day, there are many people who are living a ascetic life or monastic life in ways that are not as helpful. And you don't see this as much in the passages I'm going to specifically ask you to focus on, but there are examples of people who don't practice asceticism well, even in the text, right? So one of the things that happened then and still happens now is when people try to go off on their own and really attain some sort of real spiritual height, it's possible for people to end up being misled and to do things that are counterproductive, right? So Athanasius writes this work to propose it as a model, and it's very effective in that regard. Particularly interestingly, despite all I said about this divide between the East and the West, Anthony's life is very influential in Western Christianity. Latin translations of it are made very quickly, and it spreads, and it's very popular throughout Latin Western Christianity and is a model for Western monasticism really from the beginning. There's also some polemical things going on here, right? That is, Athanasius is making some arguments in terms of the debates he's engaged with in the course of this work. And so you're going to see references to Athanasius's arguments and debates with pagan thinking and with pagan ideas and figures, and also his defining conflict with Arianism makes its way into the work as well. And so Athanasius is going to recruit Anthony in a way as part of his argument against Arianism, and also part of his argument against the lingering paganism that was still going around in the empire in this time. But he's also, while he's opposing pagan thought in many ways, you can also see in this work a synthesis of Christian and Greek thinking, right? Again, this very Alexandrian approach. If you study the literature of this time, there are lots of lives of eminent figures, eminent thinkers and philosophers that have a lot of similarity to what we see in the life of Anthony. So on the one hand, Athanasius is opposing pagan thought and pagan living. On the other hand, he's drawing from that pagan tradition in order to help shape his account of the life of Anthony. And this is something we'll see again and again in the figures we're looking at, is this opposition to certain aspects of pagan thought or the thought of the world, but also a willingness and an ability to bring in what is beneficial and useful from non-Christian traditions and then put it to use for the faith. And Athanasius is going to be just the first of many examples of that we're going to see as we go through this class and go through the program. And then, all of that background in mind, when we read this text, what accounts for its popularity? Why are we still talking about it so many centuries later, right? And I think, as you'll see at least a hint of, and you read the passages I'm asking you to look at, and hopefully at some point, whether you can do it now or not, if you read the whole thing, what you will find there, of course, is a very powerful figure. The Anthony that emerges from this text is very striking. He seems like he would be a person who might be a little uncomfortable in some ways, right? That he's going to not let you just be complacent. And of course, in that regard, one of the things that Athanasius is doing, right, is in some ways setting him up as a Christ figure, right? That he's very Christ-like in many ways, in the ways he gives his responses to questions that are meant to trip him up. Very much like Jesus in his interaction with the Jewish leaders of his time. So, like Jesus, a striking figure, somebody who could make you a little uncomfortable. He's also a figure who's kind of in a larger-than-life context, right? So the story of Anthony is a really dramatic one, as you're going to see. He doesn't just go out and meditate and write some books and give some spiritual counsel. He does all of those things, but it's really cast in terms of this epic battle and struggle with the forces of the devil. And so you get dramatic accounts of how Anthony struggles with Satan, struggles with demonic tempters, and then, of course, also struggles with heretics and pagans who are sort of playing for that team, if you will. And so you get this very striking central figure in a very dramatic battle with the enemy. And so it's a very appealing text in terms of just the story and the power of the story. And it also, of course, one of the things we're going to talk about more as we go through this class, we talked about how there's this key shift with Constantine, right? That you move from a persecuted church where you have these martyrs who are sacrificing their lives literally for the faith. Then, of course, with Constantine, that's no longer an issue, or at least not an issue on the same scale, at least in that time and place. And so now Christianity is legal, and Christianity can even be politically advantageous. And so you have lots of people entering the church. But for those very devoted Christians, they lose, if you will, that opportunity of martyrdom, right? If you want to be a really serious Christian, that kind of constancy in the face of persecution and adversity, that's no longer really an option, right? And so one of the reasons that monasticism and asceticism gained so much prevalence in this period is that struggle, that shift, moves from opposing government persecution to this struggle with temptation, this struggle with spiritual persecution. And that's what we see going on in the life of Anthony. And so for many other Christians who maybe aren't going to the same literal lengths and physical separation and physical deprivation that Anthony does, his life is still a very compelling model of how they might, in their own ways, live out a really serious, committed Christian life. And so it's kind of a very dramatic story of what you could do if you wanted to be a very serious Christian, but are no longer going to be dragged off to the Colosseum as a result. So there's lots of reasons for this work to be as popular as it ultimately was. All right. Okay, so we've gotten some background on the patristic period, some background on Athanasius in Alexandria in his time, and then a little more specific introduction to the life of Anthony and asceticism and why this might be appealing to readers in that period. So what I want to do now is to kind of send you off to read. So I'm going to give you the first few sections of the book to look at, and this is the part where Athanasius explains why he's writing the work, and then he explains to you kind of how Anthony grows up briefly, and then how he makes this decision to enter into this lifestyle, and kind of the first steps he takes there. And then I'm going to have you skip close to the end of the work, and you can see there an example of how Anthony deals with the demonic temptations and persecutions he faces out in the wilderness, but then also how Anthony interacts with pagan thinkers and philosophers, and how he interacts with the Arians, who Athanasius is fighting with, just as an example of how Athanasius situates Anthony in this larger struggle in the church in his period. So I'm going to ask you to look at those select sections, and of course if you have the time and opportunity and want to read more, I'd encourage you to do that. But then once you're done looking at least at those assigned sections, is I'd like to hear your thoughts on this work, right? So once you take some little time to read it and reflect on it, what do you think about it, right? What questions can we ask in light of this work? And to try to do this, right, and one of the key things for many people in entering into a theology graduate program is asking some slightly different questions than we might ask, say, if we were doing a study just for spiritual enrichment at a parish or in an adult ed group or something. So to try to have a sort of critical eye when we look at this work, not in the way of thinking that we're like criticizing the work, but to really ask some difficult questions about it, right? So when we look, for example, at this portrayal of Anthony and his interaction with Greek philosophers or Arians, right? Do we find his way of responding to them convincing, right? Does this seem like a convincing account of how that conversation might have worked out? Does this really respond to what we understand of what Greek philosophers might have argued, or what pagan thinkers in this time might have thought and said? Who is Athanasius trying to reach with this work, right? The life of Anthony is said to be kind of a model for other potential monastics and ascetics. Is that his primary audience? Does he have another audience in mind when he writes this work? Who is he trying to convince? And what is he trying to convince you of when you read this work? So those are the kinds of questions I'd like you all to think about. And of course, please feel free to bring up your own questions about what's going on in these sections you're reading on Blackboard. But then also I want to make sure that we think about this in terms of, what do we make of this as 21st century Christian readers? How do we understand the life of Anthony? Because reading the Church Fathers is a great thing, I would argue, but it is very different. It's a very different period in many ways, and so we have to think about how do we translate this into our terms, and should we translate it into our terms, right? So what do we think of this as a modern reader, right? Are there similar, who would be an Anthony figure in our day, for example, right? Do we have similar spiritual exemplars that this is who we ought to be like? And are they like Anthony, or are they different in important ways? And one thing that kind of struck me, at least this time reading through this, is what would we think of somebody who was sort of a modern day Anthony in a very kind of literal way. I recently just got back from a family vacation in the Badlands of South Dakota. It's a very striking environment if you've ever been there. I think in many ways maybe not dissimilar from the desert and the mountains where Anthony is living his ascetic lifestyle. If I heard that there was this ascetic living out in the Badlands, having visions of demonic tormentors and offering spiritual advice to people, what would I make of that? Would I see that person as a potential real spiritual mentor and counselor? Or would I think that this was probably somebody who was mentally imbalanced or who maybe needed some medication? And I think that that's a question worth considering. If you encountered a figure like Anthony today, many people would think this is probably the result of some sort of psychological illness or a tumor or something like this. So what do we make of that? And even if we were to say maybe there was some sort of a neurological issue, does that make it false? Does that take away the value of his experience if there was a physiological aspect to these visions, to his desire to enter into this remote ascetic sort of lifestyle? So those are some kinds of questions that I would like you to consider. And of course, as you reflect on this and think about this in light of your own experience, please bring up the issues and questions that you find striking in relation to the reading. So, that's it for now in terms of introduction. What I'd like you to do now is to dive into the text, read the sections I've assigned for you, and then we can come back and discuss it on Blackboard and continue our conversation.